Many people have asked, why doesn't the Bible outright condemn slavery? Why does the Bible seem to condone slavery? I mean, after all, God gave the Israelites laws surrounding slavery, so it kind of looks like that God is not only approving, but he's endorsing slavery. You know, many people object to Christianity because they say that God endorses slavery. Atheist Sam Harris said that slaves were treated as farm equipment in the Old Testament. So is that true? Does God condone slavery rather than condemn it? Well, I'm going to answer that question in this video. And before I do, make sure you do me a favor, subscribe to this channel and click on the bell so that you can be notified when new videos come out. When we hear the word slave or slavery, we tend to think of antebellum slavery, right? We think of the African slave trade where people were taken from their homes against their will and shipped across the world in order to work on plantations and farms. That is not the type of slavery mentioned in the Old Testament. In fact, in the King James Version of the Bible, the term slave is only used one time, and it doesn't even occur in the original Hebrew text. It was added in by translators. Unfortunately, some of the more modern versions and translations of the Bible use the term slave and slavery a lot, which is kind of a bad translation of the word because that word is an emotionally loaded word with lots of negative history associated with it that is in no way, shape, or form connected to the type of slavery mentioned in the Old Testament. For starters, slavery in the Bible was never based on skin color, ethnicity, or nationality. In the Bible, slavery was based on economics. People sold themselves into slavery when they could not pay their debts or provide for their families. And so once that person's debt was paid, that person was free to go and find work elsewhere. And so the purpose of this type of slavery was to help the poor, which is the exact opposite of the type of slavery that was practiced in our nation for hundreds of years. Plus, biblical slavery was voluntary, right? So when an Israelite fell on hard times, they would volunteer for indentured servitude. And so they would work for somebody to pay off their debts or provide for their family, right? So it wasn't ideal, but at least it gave these people some way to make a living, to provide for themselves and their families during these hard times. You know, when my wife was in Bible college, there was a tuition that had to be paid. And so if people did not have the money to pay their tuition, a couple times a semester, they could go work at the Atlanta Event Center at MGR. And they would go and they'd spend a couple days there, and all the money that they worked went directly to pay off their tuition. Once their tuition was paid off, they didn't have to go to MGR and work anymore. And that is essentially what Old Testament slavery was. In fact, some slaves had it so good that they decided that they wanted to stay with their masters, that they didn't want to leave. They enjoyed having all of their needs taken care of, not having to worry about the finances or any of those things. And so there was a provision that was made for somebody to permanently become a slave in someone's household and work for that person. In the same way that some people choose to work under a boss for their entire lives rather than opening up their own business, there are some people who chose to be slaves for the rest of their lives. You know, the Hebrew word in our Bible translated as slave is the Hebrew word eved, which means servant or worker. It's not an intrinsically negative word. In fact, it's used many times in an honorable way. It said that Moses and Joshua were servants of the Lord. Leviticus 25:55 says this, "For the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." See, God made it clear that they were buying the services of the person, not the actual person themselves. That nobody owned the rights to another human being like a piece of property because everyone belongs to God. But even within this Old Testament system of slavery, there were laws in place to protect these servants. And so there were controls in place to help prevent poverty and thus, servanthood or servitude. For example, they had the gleaning laws where people who were in poverty were able to go along the sides of the fields and collect food. They were commanded to care for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow who were in their midst. So they were told to take care of the poor. They were told to give no interest loans, to lend freely to the poor. And so the goal was to prevent servitude whenever possible. And so there were all sorts of laws to make sure that the poor and the needy and the marginalized were cared for in society. And so this servitude or slavery, if you will, only took place during extreme cases when no other option was available. And even then, it was only limited to 6 years, right? You could not own a slave for more than 6 years unless they chose to join your household as a slave, because God's heart was never for the rich to rule over the poor. It was intended to help the poor get back on their feet, to provide for their families until they were at a place where they could provide for themselves. And even when their 6 years was up, the masters were not told to make sure that your slaves don't go empty-handed, but we want you to bless them, give them of your livestock freely. So they were to send them from their service with their hands full of blessings. Right? Masters were commanded to treat their slaves with respect. He said, you are to treat slaves like hired workers, not like the way that the Egyptians treated you when you were slaves. Injured slaves were free to be released. And so if you got angry and you punched one of your slaves, that slave was free to go and you were stuck with the debt. In fact, if a master ended up killing one of his servants or slaves, that master would be put to death. There was a no right of return, which was foreign in that culture. And so if a, runaway slave came into your city, you weren't required to go take that person back. You're supposed to let that person remain safely in your city. You're not to return them to a harsh master. Old Testament scholar Christopher Wright said, the slave in the Old Testament was given human and legal rights unheard of in contemporary societies. And so the fundamental rights that slaves possessed in the Old Testament was unheard of at this time. The Old Testament text is the first appeal in world literature that treated slaves as human beings. So this was unheard of at the time it was given. And plus, we always have to remember when reading the Old Testament that this was never God's ideal, that this was given to Israel for a limited time. This was only given to one group of people for a limited time, and it was given because of the hardness of people's hearts. It was given in order to move society forward in the right direction. And so whenever we read the Old Testament commands, we always have to look at them in the cultural context in which they were given. We have to look at the other laws and codes in the nations that surrounded them and then compare them with what God said in His law in the Old Testament, because God worked within these fallen cultures in order to move them in a redemptive direction, which is exactly what He did with the subject of slavery. And so the slavery mentioned in the Bible is nothing like our modern day slavery. Both the Old Testament and New Testament condemn the practice of kidnapping, or what is in some translations called man stealing, which is exactly what took place in Africa from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Exodus 21:16. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So the idea that you could take someone against their will and force them to be your slave or sell them to somebody else was not only against the law, it was punishable by death. In the New Testament, slave traders are listed among the ungodly and sinful and are put in the same category as people who kill their own mother and father. The type of slavery mentioned in the Bible is nothing like our modern day slavery. Our modern day slavery is condemned clearly in Scripture. Rather, the kind of slavery that is supported in the Bible was a provision that was put in place to help the poor get back on their feet. And those individuals, though while they were considered to be slaves in that sense of the term, they still maintained the full rights and privileges that belonged to any Israelite citizen. If you found this video helpful, do me a favor and smash that like button for me. Share this video with a friend. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and click on the bell so that you can be notified when new videos come out. Thanks again for watching. And remember, if it's not good, God's not done. Thank you.